For the current entity named United Mexican States, see Mexico. The Second Federal Republic of Mexico is the name given to the second attempt to achieve a federalist government in Mexico. Officially called the United Mexican States, a federal republic was implemented again on August 22, 1846, when interim President José Mariano Salas issued a decree restoring the 1824 constitution. Like the Mexican Empire, the First Federal Republic and the Centralist Republic, it was a chaotic period, marked by political instability that resulted in several internal conflicts which comprised the Reform War. Other events during this period were the dictatorship of Santa Anna, the sale of the Mezilla Valley, and the promulgation of the Constitution of 1857. During this period, there were two international conflicts: the conclusion of the war between Mexico and the United States and the war with France. The Federal Republic lasted almost 17 years and was ruled by 14 presidents. The Republic was dissolved on July 10, 1863 with the decree of a change of government to a model of hereditary monarchy. This began the Second Mexican Empire, ruled by Maximilian I. Establishment. In the midst of war with the United States, Mariano Paredes yHeralder staged a coup against the government of interim President José Joaquín de Herrera. Shortly afterwards, the Congress appointed him as interim president. The vice presidency went to Nicolas Bravo. On July 28, 1846, Mariano Paredes left the presidency to command the army in battle against the Americans, and Vice President Bravo took office. On August 4, the Federalists led an uprising, causing the resignation of President Bravo. Mariano Salas took office as provisional president on August 6. On August 22, he re-established the 1824 Constitution and called an election. With the Constitution again in force, centralism ended and the federal system was restored. Mexican Cession. The war between Mexico and the United States officially began on May 13, 1846, but there had already been battles before the date. Mexico, in turn, declared war on the United States on May 23. After the declarations of war, U.S. forces invaded Mexican territory in Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila and Alta California, while at the same time blocking the ports of Tampico, Carmen, Guaymas, Mazatlan and San Blas, and occupying Santa Fe, San Diego and Los Angeles. The main U.S. force continued through to the Rio Grande and into Mexico, defeating the forces of Pedro Ampudia in the Battle of Monterrey. On December 24, the Congress declared Antonio López de Santa Anna acting president and Valentín Gómez Farías vice president. Gómez Farías assumed the presidency in place of Santa Anna, who was fighting the U.S. After the battles of Angostura, Padilla, Churubusco and Molino del Rey, the castle of Chapultepec was defended by young cadets who became known as Niños Héroes. During the assault, the castle generals were taken prisoner. The fall of Chapultepec had two immediate consequences: the U.S. occupation of Mexico City and the resignation of Santa Anna from the presidency on September 16, 1847. Following the resignation of Santa Anna, Manuel de la Peña y Peña assumed the office. On September 26 he established the seat of federal power in Toluca and in Querétaro, where Congress convened. On November 11, de la Peña left office to serve as Chancellor and negotiate peace with the United States Congress. General Pedro María Anaya was appointed substitute president. Anaya, refusing to satisfy the land claims of the United States, resigned on January 8, 1848. Manuel de la Peña y Peña was again named provisional president, and was dedicated to negotiating peace. On February 2, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, in which Mexico ceded 2,400,000 square kilometers of territory. De la Peña was able to save for Mexico the Baja Peninsula and its union by land with Sonora and sovereignty over the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Facing criticism for the signing of the treaties, de la Peña wrote, "He who would qualify the Treaty of Guadalupe as dishonorable by the extent of the ceded territory, can never understand the sorrows that cease by ending war." The territories that have been ceded by the treaty are not just lost for the sum of 15 million pesos, but to regain our ports, the final cessation of all evil and of all sorts of horrors, and to comfort many families. 1848 to 1853. Manuel de la Peña y Peña called for elections. Congress chose José Joaquín de Herrera, who took over as president June 3, 1848. Herrera used the money for war damages stipulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to pay foreign debt, pacify the country and pay salaries. He also achieved re-annexation of Yucatan, which was in a precarious situation caused by the caste war. Congress also sent a request for the creation of the state of Guerrero, and contracted the construction of the Mexico City-Veracruz Railway, and awarded another contract for a telegraph line between Mexico City and Puebla. Mariano Salas was elected in the disputed election of 1850, which had involved former presidents Manuel Gómez Pedraza, Nicolas Bravo and General Juan Nepomuceno Almonte. Herrera was the second president of Mexico to complete his term, and handed over power to Mariano Salas on January 5, 1851. Salas attempted unsuccessfully to overcome bankruptcy and encourage mining. Agriculture and industry were almost non-existent. British and American claims were financed on bonds and building permits, and Salas had to overcome several uprisings against his rule. However, the telegraph proceeded to the city and the port of Veracruz, and the same route was granted to a railroad company. The financial plight sparked a revolt that aimed to return Santa Anna to power. Unable to cope due to lack of resources and the refusal of Congress to grant him extraordinary powers to govern, Salas resigned the presidency on January 5, 1853. In his resignation letter, Salas asked Congress to name Juan Bautista Ceballos to assume the duties of government during the organizing of elections. After a quick vote, Congress named Ceballos interim president. He ordered the dissolution of both houses of Congress, which were plotting for the return of Santa Anna. Members of Congress instigated the garrison in Mexico City, which rose in support of Santa Anna and sparked riots. Ceballos resigned the presidency on February 7. A military group appointed Manuel Maria Lombardini acting president. Lombardini arranged the return of Santa Anna, organized a sham election, and on March 17 issued a decree making Santa Anna president. Before Lombardini left office, a decree was issued declaring Santa Anna captain general of sea and land, with absolute powers. Lombardini left the presidency on April 20, which began the dictatorship of Santa Anna. Santa Anna dictatorship. Antonio López de Santa Anna again assumed the presidency on April 20, 1853 at age 59. 2 days after using his extraordinary powers decree, the rules for the administration of the republic were put into effect. These rules eliminated any control over the executive. Political changes. Officials recessed state and territorial legislatures. On September 21, it was decreed that the states again be known as departments. A number of territorial changes followed. Decree of May 29, 1853, established the territory of Tehuantepec, with its capital at Minatitlan. Decree of October 16, 1853, established the territory of the Isla del Carmen. Decree of December 1, 1853, created the territory of Sierra Gorda, with its capital in San Luis de la Paz, and added the district department of Tuxpan, Veracruz. Decree of December 10, 1853, department instituted in the district of Aguascalientes. Decree of February 16, 1854, endorsed the District of Mexico, Federal District. During 1853, Santa Anna issued several other decrees arranging for printing, reordering public finances, expropriation, the right to work, the restoration of the Society of Jesus and the return of the former property held by the government. On December 16, he issued the most controversial decree of his dictatorship, stating that the nation would continue with extraordinary powers as long as necessary, and he would be addressed as His Most Serene Highness. On December 30, Santa Anna signed the Gadsden Purchase, selling 76,845 square kilometers in the states of Sonora and Chihuahua to the United States for 10 million pesos. On January 9, 1854, he imposed a tax levy on doors and windows, and on February 23, a tax on the exterior lights of houses. Because of this series of decrees and the sale of national territory, on March 1, General Florencio Villarreal proclaimed the Plan of Ayutla. This marked the beginning of the Plan of Ayutla and the end of Santa Anna's rule. Preoccupied with the revolt, Santa Anna issued a new series of decrees. Among these were exceptions to the tax on doors, windows and lights, prohibitions on a republic and a tax on the government, and decreeing the death penalty for those with a copy of the Plan of Ayutla who would not surrender to government troops. He then conscripted and led an army of 6,000, confronted in Guerrero against the army of Ignacio Comonfort. Santa Anna's army was decimated in large part by the defection of soldiers forced to fight. He decided to return to Mexico City. On his way back, he punished several people who had supported the Plan of Ayutla. In 1853, he sponsored a contest for the best ode to the motherland. On September 15, 1854, in the midst of the Revolution of Ayutla, it was presented in the National Grand Theatre as the national anthem. In 1855, despite repression and terrorism against civilians Santa Anna considered suspects, the Ayutla Revolution was gradually conquering the states of the Republic. On August 12, Santa Anna resigned the presidency and fled to Colombia. He tried unsuccessfully several times to return to political life. He offered his services to Benito Juarez, to the French during the war with Mexico, and to Maximilian I, but all refused. Santa Anna tried to return to Mexico during the Second Empire, but was arrested in Veracruz and deported. He lived a while in St. Thomas, and again tried to return to Mexico after the triumph of the Republic. Juarez banned him on pain of death, but he landed in Yucatan and was arrested July 30, 1867. Although the charges against him carried the death penalty, the court-martial that tried him in the castle of San Juan de Ulua sentenced him to 8 years in exile. The judges who sentenced him spent 6 months in prison for similar charges. Santa Anna lived in St. Thomas, Puerto Plata, the Dominican Republic, and Nassau. Before his sentence, he unsuccessfully requested amnesty several times from President Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada. Santa Anna died in Mexico City on June 21, 1876. 1857 Constitution. After the fall of Santa Anna, Martin Carrera was named interim president by the military garrison of Mexico City on August 15, 1855. When Carrera resigned, Romulo Diaz de la Vega took over as de facto president on September 12. On October 4, Liberals under the yHeralder plan named John N. Alvarez interim president. The most important act of the Alvarez government was the convening of a constitutional assembly to draft a new constitution that would replace the Constitution of 1824. The Constitutional Congress of 1856 convened amid a clerical uprising on February 18, 1856 with a speech by President Ignacio Comonfort. Topics discussed were the attribution of powers, division of territory, individual rights and freedom of worship. The Constitutional Congress divided into two parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives. Among the Liberals were former President Valentin Gómez Farías, Santos de Gallardo and Melchor Ocampo. Among the Conservatives were Antonio Aguado, Mariano Arizcorita and the governor of Durango, Marcelino Castaneda. Impact. The Constitution of 1857 was a watershed in the history of Mexico. It maintained the basic principles of political liberalism, equality before the law and abolition of the privileges of the army and the church. It claimed to uphold individual and political rights. The delegates, under pressure from conservatives, were unable to establish the principle of freedom of religion. Still, the Church was strongly opposed to the Constitution and threatened to excommunicate all public officials who took the oath. This atmosphere of discontent led to the liberal-conservative civil war known as the Reform War. The Constitution of 1857 approved several changes in the political division of the Mexican territory: the merger of Nuevo León and Coahuila, the creation of the state of Guerrero, 3 of the 4 federal territories and the free states of the Federation. The only federal territory was Baja California. The federal district was called the Valley of Mexico State, but only if the Federation retained the power to move it to another site. On February 26, 1864, Nuevo León was separated from Coahuila and regained its status as a sovereign state. The War of Reform. On November 23, 1855, President Alvarez issued the Decree of Law on the Administration of Justice and the Court's Organic Federation. It abolished church and military privilege, and declared all citizens equal before the Catholic Church. The Church almost immediately protested against the law, arguing that it directly undermines the rights of the Church. Several bishops declared that they would abide by the law of Juarez, and demanded that the law be revised by the Vatican. Opposition to this law resulted in several popular uprisings, such as the Plan of Sierra Gorda and the Zacapoaxtla Plan. On January 27, 1856, Comonfort decreed civil registry law, and on June 23 decreed a law confiscating property owned by corporations and the Church. This law required civil and ecclesiastical bodies to sell their houses and land, and prohibited the Church from purchasing property. The Catholic Church protested against both laws, and began inciting people to civil disobedience. The 1857 Constitution was liberal, and divided Mexican society into 2 groups. The liberals, known as pure or red, were largely composed of former insurgents, landowners, Creole merchants and artisans. They sought to establish a regime of freedom and equality among citizens. The conservatives were composed of civilian and military officials, lawyers, the Spanish and most of the clergy. They sought to preserve the social and political institutions inherited from the colonial era. On April 11, Comonfort enacted a law on rights and parish perquisites. This law prohibited the charging of fees, parish perquisites and tithing. This was the last of the three reform laws which threatened the privileges of the Catholic Church. On September 16, 1857, the new constitution came into force. Legislative power was integrated on 8 October, with the executive branch headed by Ignacio Comonfort, the judiciary, headed by Benito Juarez as President of the Supreme Court, started on December 1. Plan of Tacubaya. The new constitution was rejected by a large part of society, which had the support of the clergy and the army. Comonfort, aware of the limitations imposed by the new regime, proposed reforms to strengthen the government and mitigate radical measures. However, Congress rejected them. Given the delicate situation, Felix Zuloaga and other generals convinced Comonfort to convene another Congress to draft a new constitution more in keeping with the customs of the nation. On December 17, Zuloaga proclaimed the Plan of Tacubaya. Comonfort joined the Plan of Tacubaya, which began the 3-year war. Beginning of the war, the Plan of Tacubaya demanded the repeal of the Constitution of 1857, the abolition of Ignacio Comonfort's permanence in office with absolute powers, and the convening of an extraordinary Congress, which would develop another charter to guarantee the true interests of the people. On December 19, Comonfort published a manifesto explaining the reason for his coup d'état under the Constitution. Supreme Court President Benito Juarez had been the constitutional interim president since December 18. Juarez took office that day and was imprisoned along with Isidoro Olvera, President of Congress. The states of the country were divided into those who supported the Plan of Tacubaya and those defending the constitutional order. Conservatives, meanwhile, lobbied for repeal of the Comonfort liberal reforms. He refused. On January 11, 1858, Comonfort dissolved Congress and released Juarez. He tried to seek reconciliation with the liberal wing, and armed clashes took place against the conservatives. The Zuloaga Brigade rebelled and called for reform to the Plan of Tacubaya, with Comonfort removed as president. Felix Zuloaga was named president that day. Comonfort, 10 days afterwards, declared himself defeated and went into exile. Parallel presidents Benito Juarez restored a constitutional government in Guanajuato on January 19, 1858. The states supporting the constitutional government recognized Juarez as the legitimate president of Mexico. Felix Zuloaga, declared president by a board of representatives of the states supporting the Plan of Tacubaya, was established in Mexico City. The progression of conservative troops forced Juarez to move to Guadalajara on February 13. When Guadalajara was attacked, he moved to Colima on March 20. Since Juarez needed a place controlled by liberals and resources to support his government, he sailed for Panama and on to Veracruz. At first the conservatives had the advantage. They were in Mexico City, and had the support of the clergy and the army. The liberals lacked a professional army, and the states with militias supported Juarez alone. The United States proposed to both governments the purchase of Baja California, which was rejected by both. Finally, the United States recognized the government of Juarez on April 28, 1859. In July, he issued 3 decrees from Veracruz: the law nationalizing church property, the Civil Marriage Act, and the organic law governing civil registration. The liberals supported the law under its new political banner, and emphasized the religious nature of the struggle. The second half of 1859 was the same as the previous year. Winning battles, the conservatives and liberals quickly recovered. On the conservative side, Felix Maria Zuloaga, who was overthrown by Manuel Manuel Robles Pezuela's Christmas plan, was restored to office in January 1859. Miguel Miramontes was released in February, lacking financial resources. In September the Conservatives signed the Monalmont Treaty. In December the Liberals, contesting the usurpation of the nationalization law, signed the McLean-Ocampo Treaty for $4 million. Juarez, receiving $2 million as an advance payment and military aid, was to capture the maritime squadron off Veracruz. Miramontes. However, the treaty was not approved by the United States Senate. Juarez received the money without giving anything in return. End of the war. The Civil War, which had exhausted and impoverished the country, wound down in 1860. On December 4, Juarez decreed laws on religious freedom, which allowed each person to be free to practice and choose the religion and forbade ceremonies outside churches. On November 6, Juarez called for elections of deputies under President of the Republic. Liberal victories began in the battles of Peñuelas and Silao. Liberals won decisively at the Battle of Calpulalpan on December 22, in which the Conservative Army disintegrated. The Liberal Army made its triumphal entry into Mexico City on January 1, 1861, which marked the end of the War of Reform. Foreign intervention in the Second Empire. The Civil War was costly and had a negative balance on all sectors of the Mexican government, especially agriculture and the diplomatic arena. Both sides acted in ways affecting Mexicans and foreign interests, such as forced loans, confiscations, murder and debts from foreign powers. The most important deal was that of Miguel Miramontes, who signed a loan of 15 million pesos. When Juarez occupied Mexico City, he expelled the representatives of Spain, Guatemala and Ecuador, the papal nuncio, Archbishop of Mexico, and a bishop of Michoacán for openly supporting the conservative government. The end of the War of Reform was not the end of the Civil War. With the Conservative Army decimated, it became a guerrilla operation under the leadership of Leonardo Marquez, who in June 1861 murdered Melchor Ocampo, Santos de Gallardo and Leandro Valle. Juarez won the elections held in November, and took office as constitutional president July 15, 1861. The country's precarious economic situation led Juarez to suspend foreign debt payments for 2 years. Napoleon III called Spain and the UK to a meeting in London to discuss a joint stance against the government of Mexico. On October 31, 1861, the three countries signed a document known as the London Convention, which blocked Mexican ports and authorized customs to press for the payment of debts. In the face of the external threat, the Congress reluctantly granted extraordinary powers to Juarez on December 11. When foreign ships arrived in Veracruz, Juarez offered no resistance, and allowed them to disembark at the port, seeking to resolve the conflict diplomatically. Foreign Minister Manuel Bent met with commissioners of the foreign powers. Spanish and English claims were considered reasonable. Both nations signed treaties with Mexico, and by so doing accepted the temporary suspension of payments in April 1862. The wandering government and the end of the Republic. During 1862, battles between Mexico and the French continued. The battles of Dry Canyon and Cerro del Borrego followed the Battle of Puebla. Both were French victories. After the arrival of reinforcements from France was the Siege of Puebla, in which the city fell to the French on May 17, 1863. After the fall of Puebla, French troops went to Mexico City. On May 31, Juarez and his cabinet left Mexico City and moved to San Luis Potosí and began his errant government, which finally settled in Paso del Norte. On June 1, 1863, Garrison Commander General Bruno Martinez issued a manifesto favoring French intervention in Mexico and recognizing Frédéric Faure as ultimate authority in the country. José Mariano Salas, former president of Mexico and restorer of the Federal Republic, took over Mexico City from June 1 to 10. On June 16, General Faure decreed the formation of a superior board of governors, which on June 24 named a triumvirate to take over the executive branch: Juan Nepomuceno Almonte, José Mariano Salas and Pelagius Antonio de la Bastida. On July 8, a 215 notables assembly was installed. On July 10, it established a monarchy and offered the crown of empire to Maximilian of Austria. This decree marked the end of the Second Federal Republic, beginning the Second Mexican Empire. On July 11, the board consisted of Almonte, Salas, La Bastida and the Regency of the Empire, which ruled until the arrival of Maximilian in Mexico. On October 3 at the Castle of Miramar, the Mexican delegation was read the official request of Mexican monarchists for occupation of the throne of Mexico. Maximilian accepted the crown of the Mexican Empire, and arrived in Veracruz on May 28, 1864. He went to Mexico City with his wife Charlotte, where he was crowned on April 10, 1864 in the Metropolitan Cathedral.